Thank you, Randy. So thank you, everyone from the AIA Baltimore, Margaret, Randy. It's really great to present in this forum. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. I believe you can see my screen now. Hello?
Yes, we could see it.
Okay, great, thank you. Yes, so it's a pleasure to take part in today's events, and I'm actually doing a presentation which is Building and Unbuilding, Building Unbuilding, and it represents work that I've done as a partner of studioSUMO and independent research projects, some which have been done through the office as well. And in trying to describe my work as a partner in studioSUMO, this framework kind of seemed the most fitting. So there'll be a series of projects for both building and unbuilding. And the way that they relate to each other is not, it's not necessarily linear. And I'll try to talk about that as I go through. So I'll start with projects that were for a university client, and they range from university buildings, dwelling, and a museum. The university is in Japan. It's called Josei University. My partner and I have been working, we've taught for the university and built buildings for them since 1999 was when we gave our first lecture. Then we started teaching, and then after a few years, they kind of asked us to start looking at buildings. So the red stars that you see on this campus plan show two sites. Actually, the one on your right, the building that's a hairpin shape, is our first building, and that's a business school on this campus, which is in Saitama. Yes?
Your screen isn't progressing.
Oh, it's not? What about right now?
No.
No. Oh, that's weird. Okay, it's progressing for me.
Do you want to stop screen share and try again? Flash, are you sharing the right part of it and not just like a section of the screen?
Let me try that. Thank you. So screen now. Like, I received a box that said it's not sharing right now. Let me try again. Okay. Do you see my screen now?
I do, Yolande, but it seems to be not a full screen version. So I'm just wondering whether you could be by chance choosing the wrong screen.
No, I have the right screen.
I see something now.
Now, oh, let's see. Do you see first slide now?
No.
I think it's right screen share. Did it just, hello?
Hi, you're coming in kind of fuzzy there.
But is it advanced?
No, it's not working, but I'll just open up the one that you sent me today, Yolande, and we can share from there. Will that work? All right, everyone can see this?
Yes, I see it.
Thank you, Margaret.
A little fuzzy, but okay. So could you, oh, how should we do this? Can I just raise my finger and you'll advance?
I don't see you, but yes, we can.
Okay. Well, please advance. Okay, advance. So the first project is a business school, and it's 7,500 square feet. It's navigating a hill. It's at the back of the campus, and it's navigating a hillside. Next slide, please. Right. So what you're seeing here is kind of in the center of the building, where the staircase is taking you up to the hillside. The blue are the classroom wings that you see. The building consists of classrooms, a graduate center, cafe, 2 auditoria, media center, and offices. Margaret, I actually see your dialog box on top of the images. Yeah. Okay, so this is basically just kind of showing you the way that the building navigates the landscape, that it's 3 stories. and the kind of general layout, which is, as I described, a kind of hairpin. Next slide, please. These are just views of the interior. So in our early projects, we tended to work with more simple forms and colors, kind of brighter colors. There's some patterning. There's a pattern on the floor that you can see in the carpet that also goes on the walls and goes on the ceiling. It's also a pattern that's in the landscape in this project. Next, please. This is just showing kind of the way the pattern on the floor and the walls go and the view toward the hill. Next, please. Okay. So in the last project, we worked in general on these projects in Japan. We do a concept design. We, as part of that concept design, design furniture, select all the finishes, the color scheme, and work on a concept for the landscape. So this is a different campus, but the same university, and the red circle is showing you the site for this project. Forward.
Yes.
Oops.
That's fun.
So this is a dormitory this is actually our most recent project that was done in 2017 for the university. And it's basically a kind of metal louver screen, which is in front of a single loaded corridor building. Next, please. This cutout in the center is the entry. To the left is the kind of more formal entry for visitors that goes to a gallery and the library for students. And then to the right is the passage for students. Next, please. So this is after you go through the gallery, this is a little patio through that entry that you can see. Next, please. And this is above that patio, a patio for the students where their library and kitchens are. And so basically you can see here the louver kind of system and the way that there are projecting balconies, which are also covered with the louvers throughout the building. So the upper levels are the housing, and the bottom levels are the public programs, some seminar rooms. Next, please. This is a shot inside the corridor where the dormitories are. It's actually a doubled corridor. So the view of what you see right now is the exterior corridor, which is open to the air, and then there are sliding glass doors on the left, and beyond that is another corridor to the dormitory rooms. So the way that this works is that in the better weather, the doors can be opened and pocketed, and then the corridor kind of doubles in size, and air can go through the whole space. Next, please. So these are just shots of different scenes like reception, the kitchen, the library, the gallery, and then just some details. Blue is actually the school's color, so that's why both of these projects have blue. Next, please. So for this is showing the dormitory rooms. We designed beds that would be over desks so that each student had a place to work in their room. And the room size varies from singles to quads. And that was based on trying to accommodate different price points for students. Next, please. And these are just details. It's actually a concrete building that the louvers are wrapping around. So the north face doesn't have the louvers on it. It's just pure concrete, but the other faces have the louvers. Next, please. Next, please. Next, please. Okay, so back to the Saitama campus. At the front of the campus, we were asked to design a building. So it's basically the first building that you would see when you enter, and it's a small museum for the collection of the founder of the university. Next, please. So this is that project. It's made of concrete precast panels that that have a kind of open air slots. That's what you see here in the facade. Next, please. So this is the front face as you enter, and basically there are two ways to enter the building. If you go through the path on the left, you basically circulate and remain outside until you get to the back of the building, and then you're in a kind of garden space and the rear of the building. If you move along to the right, then you enter actually at midpoint, you enter inside the museum proper. Next, please. So these are kind of just showing diagrams showing the design of the building. Originally, we designed it so that it didn't have to have an elevator to save costs. So that's where the ramping system came from. It's basically 3 galleries. One is, we call it a black box gallery, one's a white box gallery, and the other is a glass box gallery. So the glass box gallery is the one that's at the bottom, the white box is above it, and the black box gallery is kind of to the rear of this image. And that's the more traditional gallery. In the end, once a curator got assigned to the project, it had to have an elevator to move things, but by then the design stuck. Next, please. The project, I forgot to say, the project is actually, those 3 boxes are within another kind of wrapper, which is the wrapper with the openings. So here are the 2 paths. The one on the left is the exterior path that kind of takes you to the back of the building, to the glass box, which you can kind of see the glass wall, and you remain outside, so you see the landscape there. And then on the right, as you move through, you see the landscape in the distance, and then as you're walking, the entry, which is pretty discreet, is on the left. Next, please. So then this is showing the outer wrapper, the way that it kind of forms part as landscape and then wraps and around the galleries. The galleries had to be climate controlled, and so the idea of the wrapper is that it's not, the motif of the wrapper is taken after rain motifs in ukiyo-e prints. The traditional gallery is a gallery for ukiyo-e prints. Next, please. And then this is inside, so you're in the middle entering into the reception area. To the left is a reception desk. Kind of beyond that to the left is one gallery, and then to the right is another gallery. Down the stairs is the glass box gallery, and there's a little bridge over that. Next, please. So these are just shots showing the interior concrete, which was cast in place using a technique. It's a very traditional Japanese technique of like kind of positioning the formwork in such a way that it leaves an imprint of the wood on the concrete. And we did it in such a way that we had different depths. So there were thicknesses that were projected in the concrete. So in the plan, you can kind of see the center is where you enter into the two galleries on the left. Next, please. So this is the traditional gallery, very like kind of, I mean, this is basically like a traditional Japanese gallery with black surfaces and then kind of a white surface for where the art would be. Next, please. This is the glass box gallery as you're coming around. And this gallery serves as a meeting place for the university and for community members, and it displays art from both of those groups. Next, please. And this is just a view from the rear looking back. Next, please. Okay, so the next series of projects that I'll show are quite different. How they relate is not, the subjects are very different, but the way that they relate has to do more with formal affinities. So the way that we use texture, the way that, like, I'm very interested in pattern, kind of material effects, and also the use of light in the projects is similar. Next, please. So this project, Intimate Landscapes, excuse me, of the Shotgun House, is kind of research on shotgun houses. Forward, please. And it was an artist/architect installation at Project Row Houses in Houston, Texas, which is in the 3rd Ward of Texas. That's a historic district with these historic shotgun houses. And this house, for me, became a kind of meditation on domesticity for like inhabitants for this housing type. It's said that the type comes from West Africa via plantations, and it's similar to the dwellings that slaves dwelled in. So thinking about domesticity in the house and about past inhabitants, I kind of went way back looking at potential slave inhabitants and what domesticity might mean for them. And so in this, the house got divided into a series of fields, and the fields had to do with texts that, both texts that I found and the idea of how a house, how domesticity is defined in a house. So often we define domesticity through the hearth, you know, the place that kind of draws people together. Then there's the idea of like kind of coming together, community, places where you meet. And for this set of potential inhabitants, what I did was I looked at narratives of freed slaves. And in those narratives, next please. In those narratives, I put them into the different fields and grouped them in the house. So what you're seeing in this set of representations is the idea of the narratives being kind of mapped into the house as an environment. And it had 2 phases where it could be a house of light and a house of darkness. Next, please. So also, the house itself had some kind of telltale signs. One was it's a shotgun, which means that the front door and the back door line up with each other. And there's the myth that just from the name that, you know, you could shoot a gun from the front door and the bullet would fly out the back. So the path that's on the ground is actually a series of light boxes, which I installed in the floor, which kind of inscribe that path. Then to the left, there are right angle light boxes, which actually are where walls used to be. There used to be partitions in this house for rooms. So even though it was quite small, it was even smaller because it had, I think like 1, 2, 4, it was divided up into 4 or 5 rooms. Next, please. Next, please. So this is showing the text on the glass and then reflected onto the floor as shadow. Next, please. So the narratives that I found were narratives that had to do with autonomy, narratives that had to do with like love and family, narratives that had to do with community, and there was one more. I think family I separated from love. It was love and kindness. And so the narratives of love were actually narratives where people sold themselves back into slavery or did something like that so that they could be with someone they love. Narratives of community were, they actually revealed the great risks that people had to take to actually come together. And that was usually done in the plantation grounds. So in the fields around the plantations proper, where those were the places where slaves from neighboring plantations could meet, often without permission, to have church, to get news of other people, to meet each other. The narrative of autonomy, one that really struck me was a woman recounting how when she was a little girl, freedom came and she didn't have anywhere to go and no one really told her it had happened. So she was still at the home where she had been held captive, and some soldiers came and told her she was free and that she should go. And they kind of, you know, took her and put her on a horse, but they didn't let her get her favorite, she had like a favorite doll and she couldn't bring the doll. And so to me, that was a sign of autonomy, a sign of a sense of self. So she had something that she cherished that, you know, even though she was free, she couldn't bring it with her. Next, please. So the next project, De facto de jure, is another installation project that was mapping cities along train line, the Southern Crescent train line, which was the last private train line to become part of Amtrak. And this train line was also a migration route from the south to the north during what we call the Great Migration, like the latter part of the Great Migration, especially of African Americans fleeing a repressive South for jobs and opportunities to the north and the West and Midwest. Next, please. So the city that I was given was Philadelphia, and I used Philadelphia to map all the other cities. For this installation, I was one of 10 people. We were asked to make a kind of traveling valise. And so this traveling valise became, I don't know, like it became one, like a registration of the laws and customs of traveling. So laws and customs that related to public accommodations. So train travel or visiting public places and things like that. And essentially it became a map of integration and segregation from the period of like 1865, freedom of the slaves, to 1965, which is when the Civil Rights Act that we know of was passed. Next, please. So this is just kind of showing the index for each state. To your right is like the segregation index, and to the left of the box is the integration index. And so these are the initials for the cities, and then the index projected on the outside of the box. On the interior of the box, there are a series of plates that have diagrams of the laws that were passed and the public accommodations that were affected. And then there's a card catalog with the laws themselves. Next, please. This was all presented as a game. You would select a time. You would decide which city you wanted to go in, and it was a series of dials that you would spin that were on a leaf of the box in the interior, and then you would spin to pick a public accommodation. Next, please. And then you would pick the card from the card catalog that was associated with the time, the place, and the public accommodation, and see what the laws were if you wanted to go to that public accommodation, and the penalty for if you broke the law. Next, please. So this map is showing, you can't really read it, but it's basically 0 in the middle, positive at the top, negative at the bottom. So integration at the top, segregation at the bottom. And it starts from 0 and then moves out to the different types, like horizontally, the different types of public accommodations that you might go to. And so the dots that you see are an accumulation of laws that are passed. So this is one way of mapping. So the bigger the dot, the more laws were passed for that type of accommodation. Gray is transportation. I don't really remember what all of them are. The kind of bright red is health. The brownish is education. And so you can just kind of see where the laws were passed in time. Next, please. So this is the same type of map, but it's showing it actually in a more linear way. So it's like the laws passed, but as like lines as opposed to dots. Next, please. This map shows that there was a kind of forward and backward motion with the law, so that especially in the North, which was very interesting, what you see here is that a law would be passed and then people would break the law, and then another law would be passed which would try to clarify the law that people were breaking, usually like making it more restrictive. And this kind of back and forth happened until federal laws were passed, which were sweeping laws. So everything like was included and there was no getting around the language. So that's why I call it a sweeping law. Next, please. Okay, so the last project I'll show is, it's kind of two projects in one. It's a museum, a very small museum, 1,600 square feet in Fort Greene, Brooklyn. It was on a corner. And inside the museum, in its reception area, is the kind of project in the project. So the museum is the Museum of Contemporary African Diasporan Art. Next, please. The client asked us to have a map of Africa in the museum. And because it was a museum of the African diaspora, we actually presented a map of the African diaspora. And so what we proposed was a map for the reception area, which would be a kind of three-dimensionalized space that people could walk in, which would have migration routes of the African diaspora, and it would have slave routes, and migration from the military, economic migration. It would have just different forms of migration kind of mapped in the space. Next, please. So this map is mapped in the space, but it also was a kind of pamphlet that was given out at the space. Next, please. Next, please. Oh, I guess I should say the other thing is we wanted to not use the geography of the globe. Geography is very political, and we wanted a more neutral way to represent people. Also, in dealing with migration, something which is more less country bound and more in a way time bound. So we use the time zones and as the primary way to map the space. Next, please. So this is kind of showing the flattened out time zones and then the time zones mapped in the space on the back wall. Next, please. This is a kind of concept scheme. We did an identity for the windows, the gallery. They wanted flexible space, so we made rotating panels so it could be different sizes, and then the reception area. And the idea in the reception area was to have a play between 2D and 3D spaces. So first we mapped two-dimensionally the time zones in the space and the countries, the name of the countries and cities where migrants, well, members of the African diaspora are located. But then we also wanted to project into 3 dimensions the same thing. Next, please. So this is kind of final shots showing the projection as furniture within the reception space. Next, please. Next, please. So for this, the construction, we worked with a woodworker, a fabricator, who basically joined everything. It's all tongue and groove, and we worked out the system with him. We had to kind of draw everything, and then he figured out the parts for how to do the joinery. But it's a very simple, straightforward joinery system, and yeah, and here you can kind of see the painting on the wall and the 3-dimensional aspect. Next, please. This is showing the gallery with the flexible flexible spaces made by these huge rotating panels that we made. I believe this is the last image from this. Next, please. Yes, thank you. Okay, thank you.
You might have to share. I don't know if I can go ahead and share then. Yep, I can go ahead and do that.
Go ahead, Jen.
Yep. Move my thing down so I can see. Let's see, play. Aha, is that working for everybody?
Yes.
Yes.
Great.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Yolande. That's so inspiring. I just am like heart opening by all the theoretical work you do and then seeing how you translate that into the real world. So special. I'm Jennifer Gould. I'm here from the Neighborhood Design Center, or I'm in my dining room with my slippers on from the Neighborhood Design Center, not how I expected to be here. Tonight I'm going to share with you a new program that NDC is doing in partnership with the Mayor of Baltimore and the Baltimore Development Corporation, in hopes that you'll all be excited and want to join in. The program is called Design for Distancing, and we're doing this in order to access many of Baltimore's small business districts' public realms to support reemerging in this current COVID-19 universe. I think lots of you have probably seen that some cities now, including Baltimore, will start to access more of the public realm in order to support externalizing some of our business realm, and so that we can safely access that as we reemerge. So this program, Design for Distancing, is a $1.5 million investment from the City of Baltimore that's going to be managed by Baltimore Development Corporation in partnership with Neighborhood Design Center and the Bloomberg School for Public Health at Johns Hopkins, in order to design and install public space interventions in up to 17 of our main streets and retail business districts. And this program will happen in 3 parts. In order to reemerge from our homes, we're going to need to unbuild some of our traditional commercial environments, taking over transportation space and occupying sidewalks and streets for food and services this summer. In order to do that, we're going to enact a 3-part process and program. We'll be issuing a design brief and calling on designers from here locally, as well as far as the field as are interested, to submit concepts for how we can do that. We'll be issuing some of the most exciting ideas in the form of a digital pattern book. And then we'll be working with the Main Streets districts and design build teams to actually install those in our Main Streets districts. And all of this is going to be happening on a very fast timeline. The design brief development is going to be happening essentially tomorrow. We'll be issuing very soon, and then asking for a quick turnaround on sketches, and then moving some forward to design development, and then simultaneously reaching out to people to do formulate design build teams that will actually install them in the main streets and retail business districts. So that stakeholder group that will be putting together the design brief is put together by some of the global leading experts in understanding what's happening through COVID-19, from the Johns Hopkins University Bloomberg School of Public Health. There'll be representative business owners that are tackling this in real life right now, designers and makers from the Baltimore community, city agencies who will be either helping us make the public space accessible, helping service those spaces, helping to provide the funding to build things, helping provide leadership through coordination of everything, as well as leaders who are coordinating those retail districts. After the call for concepts, we'll be putting those together in a digital pattern book that will be available worldwide, as well as stipending those lead ideas to contribute to that to that book. There's $50,000 total in stipends that we'll be just sharing amongst up to 10 winners. And then the next phase, we will be, we're currently starting to reach out and identify local teams that would like to put together a design build team to actually implement these projects in our local districts. So if you're interested, we'll be sharing addresses that you can send interest to, as well as there'll be an online form. Those teams will be again, stipended about $10,000 for the actual customization of the pattern book designs for the local districts, and then we'll be awarded a grant from BDC that will fund the implementation. Those implementations will probably happen at a few scales, depending on the district, varying from 1 or 2 businesses all the way up to the scale of a whole block. If you can imagine sort of a parking day heavy sort of implementation that would be feasible through our local parklet program, that's the kind of scale that we're looking for. We're hoping that implementation will happen in early July and take place quickly so that we can safely provide space for people to be outdoors over the summer and through the fall. So not the kind of activation that would require building permits, but be more movable but durable items that can support people either queuing or consuming or waiting for services, all with those sort of underpinnings of public health built in. So we are definitely looking for you to join us. The mayor will be formally announcing this program early next week, and the website and social media platforms will be live at that time. So keep your eyes and ears peeled for a formal announcement beginning of next week so that you can all get in on it. I think that as we're all experiencing the current COVID-19 universe, we really are seeing some interesting sort of broader movements that are coming out of this that I want to take a moment to address too. This moment really does allow us to evaluate some of our assumptions about our day-to-day lives. Anytime we're in a crisis moment, you can see really where those strongest fracture points are, as well as the places that we perhaps thought were unmovable that we might want to second guess or advocate for moving. And so I really think of that unbuilding theme of tonight from 2 perspectives. I think that we, over the summer and fall, are going to need to unbuild some of our traditional structures for consumer engagement in the world. You know, things that we assumed we would normally walk in through a front door, be in close contact to experience and receive. If we want to maintain those structures for the future, at least in the near-term future, we need to move a lot of those components outdoors where it's safer for all of us. And we can still participate in local business. We believe we're going to try and partake of the experiences that we all love and support those businesses that we really cherish in our community in the public realm rather than in the private realm. And so really understanding the role of public space in a city as a key component of movement and commerce and access and safety and wellness. I think that there's been a movement towards really taking back public space in cities as a key layer of investment to provide the type of environment that we all want to live in. But I think that this moment through this pandemic has really highlighted what that really means. And so I think there are a number of systems that we could all put pressure on right now to say that we've been operating under a status quo that is deeply inequitable and also harmful for our future, that we can put pressure on for further dismantling right now. I think we've all seen with everybody staying home that in the very short term, our air quality has vastly changed in our urban environment, and that cars and commutes and that sort of thing aren't an absolute requirement to business as usual. We all know that environmental inequity is enormous globally, and that it's not just a measure of poverty, but a measure of communities of color. That even if you disaggregate data on poverty versus communities of color are the ones that bear the deepest brunt of our environmental inequity in the world. Furthermore, transportation is another space where right now we're giving over an enormous amount of our public space to transportation, and specifically transportation for moving and storing private personal automobiles. And in the city of Baltimore, many of those automobiles are passing through our communities of color out to the suburbs. And that this sort of use of our transportation space doesn't support our local economy, and it doesn't support people who need access to that space. And we have a chance right now, I think, to grab hold of some of that space to support local business and really look at the ways that we want to return that in the future. I think that we can all see during this pandemic that there are a couple disparate things happening. One, we are all turning to sort of this broader economic system of needing to procure a lot of our goods from elsewhere and having them delivered, while also being mindful of the fact that if we don't have access to local resources at the same time, that many of those supply chains can break down, and then we're at absolute loss for access to goods. So, you know, even though we may be getting our groceries delivered from Amazon, we may realize that meat supply chains are totally disrupted, and really the safe access to that food is from your local farmer's market. Simultaneous to that, you know, a quarter of our community members are living in places with no local access to a grocery store and are utterly dependent on local markets. And that we have a moral obligation to provide food infrastructure to all of our communities, and not to leave that at the whim of say grocery store algorithms that are determining the minimum income necessary to put a grocery store in place. And simultaneously, you know, like almost 40% of people that rent in the city of Baltimore don't have a personal automobile either. So when we say that they are utterly dependent, they're genuinely dependent in a scenario where buses are now limited to essential personnel. And finally, you know, as we all stay home to do our work and schoolwork, we know that a vast number of city residents and an even larger number of city children don't have reliable Wi-Fi in their home and may have very limited digital plans that just provide them to access the basic needs. If we're going to find ourselves regularly in a scenario where digital learning, digital working is necessary, we have I think, another imperative to begin to view digital access as a utility rather than as a luxury, and assure that in the future that we can meet our obligation for all children to be able to learn in scenarios such as we're experiencing today, as well as for you know, the people that often are working service jobs. If you don't have digital access, you're never going to move to a different kind of work environment either. It's placing a multivalent burden on many of our communities. And so all of that is just to say that, you know, even as we look to resolve and participate in responding to the short-term needs through things like design for distancing, we also need to be mindful of advocating for the structures that are underpinning all of that, that we really can see in this current moment, and to join in advocating for change in the places where we live and work and want people to have quality lives, just like we are having. So I really want to thank you for your time tonight. I hope that you'll all get involved in designing these spaces for our retail districts. I'm so excited and joyful to be participating in making those things come to fruition. And I can definitely assure you that the teams that are coming together around this are impassioned about making this an exciting project to be involved in, a speedy process to be involved in without hopefully some of the usual challenges that we face in the city moving simple things forward, and that we'll all be so happy to be out there this summer in environments where we can support local business, stay safe, and know how to be together without putting anybody at risk. So thank you so much for your time tonight. I'm glad to be ending just a little bit early, so hopefully we can all talk more.
So, how you doing? My name is Evan Richardson, and I want to thank both Yolande and Jennifer for their presentations. It was just kind of right on time. As Jen says, we're in the midst of all these things. So first, I just want to thank BAF, the staff of AIA Baltimore, and then the lecture committee for allowing me just to share some thoughts of the two lectures and then just start the conversation. So I have two jobs today. One is to facilitate those questions, so definitely start putting them in the chat, and then also just to tie these things together. But I just wanted to just start really quickly, and more of all the people to thank besides Yolande is definitely Jennifer. When I got the call, I think last week, to join this lecture and to help moderate, I said that Jen is always trying to keep me in the loop. So I always thank Jen for those things to keep me in the loop, because she knows that I'm passionate about storytelling and volunteerism. So I encourage you all to sign up. I think the call goes out tomorrow, like Jen said, to for this project. So I just want to thank her for that. So I think last week we had an opportunity quickly to get introduced to what the topic, was. And I think at that time I was kind of all over the place really thinking about it. And I know that Yolande just, added a few things about the built. But I think for me, I think one of the things that I noticed that ties these things together was that we're responding, right? So I think Yolande, even with the built words, the first time I saw it today, I think we're responding, she's responding seamlessly with the landscape and making that campus unique, right? So now as you enter that space, you can see how the two are working together. So the building is responding to the landscape. I think with her unbuilt work, which was what she presented last week, I got a taste of it last week. I think she was responding to the atrocities of slavery, segregation, talking about the Great Migration, and how can those things be manifested through design, those elements that you sometimes don't even think about, those social ramifications, how can they physically be displayed? So I think that was something that was huge. And so you were responding to those things. But also Jen, I think in her presentation, just kind of start talking about how do we respond to COVID, right? Looking at our environmental systems, looking at our public spaces, how do we create these new and safe and healthy environments? So I think all these things that we're talking about was, responding. So I quickly today just got online and just kind of figure out, is that a term that we could start using as responsive design, right? And I looked it up, and actually it's a computer science term. I thought I was going to invent something new, but it's actually a term that's already out there. So I looked it up, I found a great definition. I think is actually right on time, So according to Reactive Manifesto, responsive design is the goal of responsive design is to make systems resilient, adaptable, and message driven. Okay, so just kind of, I think for both Yolande and Jennifer, these things came out today. How do we start becoming resilient through these changes, whether it's that migration or looking at slavery, being adaptable to what Jen is talking about. But I think at the end of the day, this is message driven, right? We're telling a story. And I think that's why I appreciate Jen bringing me on, because those are things that I know I'm passionate about. And hopefully as designers, majority of the folks here today being designers, through their work, they're always looking to tell that story. But now with that, creating spaces that is adaptable, that has flexibility, okay? But also telling a story, right? And especially with COVID, this time is unprecedented. We haven't gone through these times. So I'm definitely fascinated to see how we move forward as designers and making this more inclusive. So I'm going to stop there. Just some of my points. Hopefully I did you justice, Stella, and bringing that on, closing it out. But at this time, definitely ask your questions in the chat. If I feel like I'm not going to do your question any justice, I might tell you to unmute yourself. But I am going to read the questions for everyone. But I guess I could start, if everyone doesn't want to get it going. Just Jen kind of ended with a really good question. So, Jen was on point with this. Like, can we unbuild the systems that aren't going to work in the future, right? I think if Jen wants to kind of start with that, or Yolande, kind of want to start with that one. If we don't see any questions here. So I'll stop and let one of you all respond to that one quickly.
So I guess I would say that what I see the media trying to pitch as a path on at least the transportation component of it is that, there are a number of cities that have really been working to rebalance the amount of the transportation space that's given over to cars versus walkers, bikers, public transportation. and having a lot more closed streets, especially in the city centers. Over the recent years, that this moment seems to be giving an opportunity for there to be a whole trend of cities that are evaluating those networks in a prioritized way and giving over in a more light touch way, but formalized way, access to the streets almost solely for local residents to safely move about the city on foot or on cycle. And to kind of postulate what impact that has on the local economy in a broader sense. You know, will small business be able to reemerge over the summer without people showing up in cars? And I think it's an amazing testing ground for documenting whether there really is the will to be engaging business in this way, that we will all reemerge from our houses, even if it means walking, cycling. I mean, I think informally we see it happening right now, but whether when it stretches out, we'll be willing to put a stake in the ground and stick with it, I mean, I think is a very visible way. Some of the other components of making the larger scale business sector show up for similar things, I think will be more challenging because it requires a far less nimble, you know, I think small business can be very nimble. They're a little more agnostic on whether people are showing up in their cars to receive their products, and have a different kind of, you know, ability to shift. And so whether big business kind of dies, follows on, or pushes us to go back to the old way, I'm quite curious about.
It's interesting that you talked about that. I think when you get a, you know, about small businesses, I think, you know, I've been driving around, you know, here and there, and I see that they're trying to adapt with keeping their doors open, trying to invite people in, actually coming to the street, you know, coming out, which is, you know, unique as well. But then you talked about the digital inequities, and see even small businesses really looking to adapt to that as well, and looking at promotion. So of course you have your larger companies out there like Amazon, but how do we start looking at supporting them, our smaller businesses, through the digital route? So thanks for that one, Jen. So I'm gonna try to
questions for Yolande.
Yeah, well, I got Jennifer. I do have Jen. I don't know if you want. We could start with Yolande here. This is always tough to scroll up and down. Please forgive me. And seeing these. So Yolande, this is from Kelly. I know you mentioned materiality and pattern, but you can elaborate on how your research and theoretical projects inform your built work.
Yeah, so I guess first off, the projects happen at the same time in our office, and we're often asked that question, like, you know, how do they relate? And it's not in a kind of linear or like literal way. Like, I think some practices, they're more singular, and this isn't a singular practice. So the way that the built work, it relates on different levels. One level that it relates is that we're working in a different cultural context. Neither my partner or I are Japanese, and we're working in Japan. So we're working in a cross-cultural context where we are students of another culture, and you know, it's a culture that has a lot to offer in terms of design that one can learn from. But then also, it's pretty easy to make kind of cultural faux pas because it's a very, the organization is very different. And so, so I think like that's one aspect. We also have done a lot of projects with the Museum for African Art in New York, which no longer exists. It's now called the Center for Africa. But we worked with them for about 10 years doing exhibits, and we did their temporary space in Queens. And always there, we were also kind of, even though I'm African American, I've never been to Africa. And through the work on the Museum for African Art, I learned a lot about the different like countries and cities in Africa, because every exhibit that we did, we had to research it. So in a way, the kind of relationship between the projects, the research that we have to do on both is similar to research that is done on the more obvious research projects. The difference with the research projects is that that gets forefronted in a kind of, in like it's part of the concept. There's a narrative that's visible. With the architectural projects, the built projects, the narrative ends up being filled out as people live their lives. So the narrative is somewhat suppressed in the architecture because it's part of the design of the architecture. And then once the design is made, people inhabit it and they start writing new narratives. And that's actually something I've always, I don't know, it's like a kind of joy of building that happens. At least I think it's a joy that you could build something, it exists in your head. And then once you build it, it becomes part of other people's heads and their lives. And they kind of, they don't care about you and they just sort of live. And I think that's very interesting. But then the other thing I described was that there are formal affinities between the projects. So for instance, in Mokada, the last project that I showed, the linearity of that project is kind of picked up in a later project, which is the dormitory, the linearity in the dormitory screen. In the museum of the Mizuta Museum for the ukiyo-e prints, the slots that are voids in the facade, they're an inverse of the light boxes, the kind of light strips that are in the intimate landscape projects. So in that project, I was, kind of extracting part of the building, putting lights in, and sort of sealing it. And then in the museum, we were like using void spaces where light and shadow could kind of project through it. So so that's what I'm kind of describing when I talk about like formal relationships that they share.
Okay, I'm gonna go to Jen. I have a question from Mark Diocampo. How are you overcoming the regulatory and technical challenges of converting the public realm to pedestrians when the regulations are fixated over vehicular safety? It's very frustrating.
It is very frustrating on a day-to-day basis. I am trusting the BDC that they are going to be able to work with the city of Baltimore to identify a way to overcome this in the short term, with the hopes that this will be a test case for some longer term shifts. So I think that if we can take hold of this moment as a prototype moment, look for places where we can take over, especially parking lanes, and show how it works, then hopefully we can change some hearts and minds. Every Baltimore City department has some incredible people who really are quite progressive, and then some situations in which the rule boundness and habits have come to overwhelm the whole scenario. And it is our hope that the emergency state that we're in, we can utilize that and the desperate need to support our small business environment to reprioritize what's going on right now with our fingers crossed that it could have some long-term impacts. I agree with Eric Lowe that the bill passed by City Council is an encouraging step. I think we saw DOT through that bill passing that their will is in place and that they're requesting additional resources in order to support implementation. And so hopefully the manpower that they need to help assure safely implementing that work will happen.
I want to stick with Jen on this next one because I'm struggling with being on the COVID diet right now, and I just kind of want to talk about, our local farmers are suffering a blow due to local farming markets being shut down. Is there any plan to address them, and from your perspective?
Yeah, I do. I think that everybody treasures the markets in Baltimore, and that we're really coming to realize how critical they are. So I think the nearest term responses in a concerted way through the city are focused on the small business retail districts, but that they've been very careful to identify the ones that surround the markets. So the districts that we're looking at include where each public market is, as well as the major farmers markets. And so I hope that we'll be pulling them in, and if we see a gap there, we'll certainly be reaching out to them to gain additional services. But I think, we've done such a great job, I think, in Baltimore of our local businesses starting to tap into those supply chains from our regional farms, that it is just as important that we support the restaurants as it is the farmers markets themselves, because many of those small businesses now have reached the point where they're using those farms as their supply chains for the prepared meals that we receive as well, and that we need to make sure that we're mindful of supporting the full network as well as the markets. I think because the markets operate in sort of a, setting up farm stand scenario, it's both easier to spread them out quickly because they, pop up and dismantle every week. But yet it's more challenging to help people safely congregate because we're used to arriving there en masse in a very condensed period of time each week. And so to me, the temporal issue of farmers markets are as big a challenge as the setting up the stands issue. So it is something that's on my mind.
I'm going to transition to Jacqueline. I know that both Jen and Yolande spoke on race, especially through Yolande's work with race and architecture. But I'm going to give this question to Yolande. How well and should the design community be addressing the racial inequities COVID has brought to light moving forward? So I know Jen spoke about it, but I'm interested to hear what Yolande has to say on this.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is actually a question that I'm asking myself in light of the work that I've been doing. It definitely applies. When Jen was talking about digital equity, but also environmental equity, equity, food equity, transportation equity, it seems like just in general, there's a need, there's a need to address equity across the board. And I think we can start with public space, but that's a good start. And then it has to extend to these other areas. And I think what COVID-19 has shown us is how it's all very interconnected. So the way that, the air is better Animals are kind of out in, you know, in places where they had stopped coming or where they were killed if they went before. Like that's kind of like one way of seeing how the environment is responding to COVID-19. And then there are the like sad deaths that are happening that are as a result of COVID-19 too. And I personally don't, I haven't figured out how to respond to it yet, but it's definitely one of the questions that's like foremost in my mind. I'm really inspired by the Design for Distancing program though, and like as a way to start thinking about some of these issues and other like kind of other kind of items that have to do with equity that aren't necessarily wed to public space. I think that they're going to have to be addressed too.
It's crazy. I noticed the same thing about our wildlife taking back their habitat, and I appreciate. I mean, they're becoming bold, some of our animals, but I appreciate it. You know. And I think you talked about taking over the streets. I think I find that fascinating as well. And that's responding once again, I think whether it was through protesting from years ago to what we're talking about now. And I think physically actually taking over the streets. I know a lot of cities throughout the world, they actually shut off streets at certain times for pedestrian traffic, right? And so hopefully we'll see some of those things happen, you know, here in Baltimore during on-peak times and non-peak times. I think I have one more question. I was waiting for Margaret to let me know, but I think I'm gonna control that. But the one that we have another from Kelly, this is for Jen. And hopefully this will spark hopefully a lot of volunteers. Jen, so this is another selling point for you. But I'm building established systems in response to COVID is a design challenge indeed. How do you imagine measuring the effectiveness of proposed solutions?
Yeah, so we're trying to be as intentional as we can in both the design of the design brief that we'll be asking everyone to respond to, as well as the call for participants, as well as defining which communities that we're offering the opportunity to receive funding for this program to hopefully stack the deck a little bit. So on the brief side, you know, we're going to be quite conscious of designing the brief so that it responds to the variety of districts that we're hoping to engage in Baltimore, and assure both the public health side, but also that we're responding to vulnerable populations in our definition of what serving business is, that we are really focused on those local markets, personal services like barbershops, carry out food. And then on the district side, you know, really looking at, you know, reaching out to those retail business districts in, you know, that we're providing those supports in them, providing as much hand-holding as necessary to assure that communities that most need those services are receiving high quality, deep engagement and partnership from the program. And finally, assuring that through the design build iteration that we're, you know, giving priorities to MBE-WBE engagement, giving priorities in the funding allotment to districts that most need it, and just doing our best to stack the deck for the places that need it most. In terms of implementation, I think the proof is going to be in the pudding. You know, are people receiving access to the businesses that they need and just going out and doing those kind of counts, and surveys to assure that people are out in the appropriate numbers so that businesses are succeeding, as well as checking in with people that they actually feel safe and supported going there.
Thanks, Jen, for that. So I've